Now you're going to take your embroidery floss and run it through some wax, just like we did in our last lesson, and I'm going to teach you some really amazing Sashiko embroidery techniques to give it a little bit more visual and textural interest in your piece here. So if you're working with certain types of embroidery floss, you'll find that the content is a little bit different and it might separate out a little bit more easily, but that means sometimes these little strands don't stay together as easily as it would with something that has a softer, like more cottony content in it. I'm just separating some of these pieces out. And I'm going 3 and 3 because I don't want it too thick. And actually what might facilitate this process is to actually cut it ahead of time. Make sure I have the right length. If you pull it too fast, it's going to tangle, so go very slowly and always bring your hands very close to the area that you're separating the embroidery floss at. All right, successful separation. I'm going to run this through my wax a couple times, and this will actually help bind it a little bit better. This step with the wax is particularly important with the embroidery floss because it will make all these thick fibers go through other thick fibers of the fabric a lot more easily. And you really don't want to forget to iron it because as I might have mentioned before, it can leave a residue on your fabric. In this case, it might be a cool residue, but nevertheless, you want to be able to control that and make those decisions instead of a mistake making the decisions for you. Then again, there are always happy accidents. I find that even when you find these vintage fabrics and they have all kinds of stains over them, you just simply decide to put an applique there, or this is where like a gorgeous sequin will go. All right, so we're going to iron that embroidery floss. Using the press cloth, I've sandwiched it between those two layers, protecting my iron and soaking up that excess wax. And I'm going to grab the ends. Since they're not really binding together all too well, I'm going to just do them one at a time. So here's my first. And here's my second. Okie doke. So now what I'm going to do is grab my wide-eyed embroidery needle. And I'm going to pull it through the eye of the needle, not to be confused with the eye of the tiger. And if you're having a little bit of trouble with this, like I am, run just the tip through the wax again and then just cut it. This will make it kind of like a candle wick, hard enough to pull through the eye of a needle. And be sure to cut the threads at an angle. That way the first couple of threads will go through, but they'll go through entirely as a unit, as I am doing here. All right, awesome. Good job, Milda. All right, so now we're going to knot one end of it, of the 3 threads, and we're going to implement a Sashiko type of stitch, which is actually just a running stitch. It's the easiest kind, and it is actually quite meditative. So I'm going to start this piece randomly, just kind of in the middle of my pinstripe fabric. I'm going to come in from underneath. Since my thread has been knotted, it's going to stop. I'm going to make sure the other tail end of it pulls through, like so. And then I'm going to continue going in this direction, but I'm going to be taking a long stitch, a short gap, a long stitch, a short gap. And if you're working with a stripe like I am, or a really coarse grain, you can actually see that and follow that as a guideline. The objective of the stitch is definitely like more decorative, but it's also the point of it and why they used to use it in traditional Japanese clothing. It was for poorer families that couldn't afford any new clothing, so they would use the scraps from old worn out pieces of clothing, and they would just simply patch it over and put a running stitch over it because they didn't have glues or fusibles to help facilitate the process even more. So they would actually just use the stitch as a manner of stabilizing one fabric to the other. So that's what you want to be sure to do, is to catch all of those layers. And here you go, you get a wonderful long running stitch that keeps on going and going. You can put as many as you want. The traditional Sashiko method would be to run a running stitch all the way from one length of the fabric to the other length of the fabric, going row by row, all in horizontal rows. But you can freehand stitch with this. In fact, if you wanted to, you could actually choose one of these circles and start drawing some kind of like a little sphere on it. You could implement other embroidery techniques that you've perhaps picked up in this course or in others and test them out on this fabric. I think the crazier that you try things, the better the end result is going to be. This really has to look like a collage of techniques, sort of experiments and things like that. And you'll want to keep going to the end. If you're sewing a circle like this, you can sew it around once, twice, keep on going in a spiral or anything similar to that.